Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Sunnah Spark TV. An orphan stood naked in the streets of Makkah, and nobody moved. Not because they did not see him, they saw him. The chiefs saw him, the merchants saw him. The women at the doorways, the elders in the shade, the cousins who once shared meals with his father, they all saw him. A child with no garment on his body, standing in the dust with his hands stretched out, asking for what already belonged to him, his father's money, his father's inheritance. And the man who held that inheritance, the man entrusted by tribal law to protect this boy, was the one who shoved him away. That man's name would later become synonymous with something so dark that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself would rename him. But before we get to that name, before we understand why Allah sent 7 verses down from above the heavens because of what was happening in this city, we need to go back. Back to the world that made this cruelty not just possible, but normal. Makkah, in the early 7th century, was not a lawless desert outpost. It was a city of contracts, commerce, and carefully maintained hierarchies. Caravans moved north to Syria and south to Yemen, carrying leather, perfume, dried goods, and silver. The Quraysh, the tribe that controlled Makkah, had built their entire identity around 2 things, the Kaaba and trade. The Kaaba gave them religious authority over the entire Arabian Peninsula. Trade gave them wealth, and wealth in that society gave them something far more dangerous. It gave them the unquestioned right to define who mattered and who did not. At the top of this system sat the tribal chiefs, men like Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, who was so rich that his gardens were famous across the Hijaz. Men like Al-As ibn Wa'il al-Sahmi, whose trading caravans were among the largest in the region. And a man whose birth name was Amr ibn Hisham, from the powerful Makhzum clan, a man the Quraysh themselves once called Abu al-Hakam, the father of wisdom, because of his sharp mind and political influence. These were the architects of Makkah's social order. These were the men who decided how the city ran, who deserved respect, and who could be discarded. And at the bottom of that order, invisible and voiceless, were the orphans. In pre-Islamic Arabia, the word yatim did not just describe a child who had lost a parent, it described a status, a category. To be an orphan was to be unprotected. In a tribal system where your worth was measured by whose blood ran through your veins and whose sword stood behind you, the death of a father meant the collapse of everything. There was no state, no institution, no court to appeal to. An orphan's inheritance was managed by a guardian, usually a male relative, sometimes a tribal elder, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, stopping that guardian from consuming the orphan's wealth for himself. And that is exactly what happened. Routinely, openly, without shame, guardians would absorb the orphan's property into their own estates. They would use the child's inheritance to fund their trade, their homes, their feasts. If the orphan was a girl, some guardians would marry her themselves, not out of affection, but to keep control of her wealth. And if the orphan ever came asking for what was rightfully theirs, the response was not guilt, it was annoyance, it was hostility, it was a shove. This was the culture. This was the air that Makkah breathed. Cruelty toward the powerless was not seen as cruelty at all. It was just the way things were. The strong ate, the weak waited. And if the weak had the audacity to complain, they were reminded of their place. But here is where the story turns from social history into something far deeper. Because the man who would be chosen by Allah to deliver a message that would shatter this entire system, that man was himself an orphan. Muhammad ibn Abdullah, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, lost his father before he was born. Abdullah died while Amina was still carrying him. He lost his mother at the age of 6. He lost his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, the man who had taken him in and loved him at the age of 8. And then he was raised by his uncle, Abu Talib, a man of noble character but limited wealth. He knew what it meant to be a child without a father in a city that measured your value by your father's name. He knew what it felt like to depend on someone else's generosity. He knew the vulnerability, the uncertainty, the quiet fear of a child who has no shield. And Allah knew that he knew. Years later, when revelation came to him, Allah would remind him directly. In Surah Ad-Duha, the words descended like a warm hand on his chest. Did he not find you an orphan and give you shelter? It was not a rhetorical question, it was a reminder. You were that child once. You stood where they stand now, and I did not abandon you. This is essential to understand. Because the revelation that was about to come, Surah Al Maun, was not an abstract theological statement sent from the sky into a vacuum. It was a divine response to a specific world, a specific cruelty, and a specific silence. It was Allah looking at what was happening in the streets of Makkah and saying, I see this, and I am not silent. But before those 7 verses arrived, something happened that would become one of the most striking stories in early Islamic history, and it involved the very man who would be exposed by this surah. His name, the one the Quraysh gave him, was Abu al-Hakam, the father of wisdom. It was a title of honor, a recognition of his intelligence, his cunning, his ability to navigate Makkah's politics with precision. He was from the Banu Makhzum, one of the 2 most powerful clans in the city, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the world had been arranged specifically for him. But behind that title was a man whose heart had turned to stone. Not overnight, not through some dramatic fall from grace, but slowly, quietly, the way cruelty always grows, in small decisions made without consequence, in silences that became habits, in the repeated choice to look at someone weaker and feel nothing. Among the responsibilities that tribal custom placed on men of his stature was guardianship. When a man of the Quraysh died and left behind children, the tribe assigned a guardian. It was considered a matter of honor. You were entrusted with a man's legacy, his children, his wealth, his name. And Amr ibn Hisham, the man the Quraysh called Abu al-Hakam, was made guardian of an orphan boy. We do not know the boy's full name from the narrations. What we know is what happened to him. One day, this child came to Abu al-Hakam. The narration in Al-Mawardi's Alam an-Nubuwat describes the scene in a way that is almost unbearable. The boy had no garment on his body. He was virtually naked. He came to the man who held his father's wealth, the money his father had earned, the inheritance that by every law of God and tribe belonged to this child, and he asked for something, not all of it, just something, enough to survive, enough to clothe himself. And Abu al-Hakam pushed him away, not with words, not with a polite refusal. He pushed him. The Arabic verb used is yadu'u, a harsh, physical, contemptuous shoving. The kind of force you use on something you do not consider human. The kind of force that tells a child without a single word that he is nothing. The boy left, barefoot, naked, carrying the full weight of his helplessness in his small body. And Makkah kept moving. The merchants kept trading. The chiefs kept meeting in their assemblies. The sun kept crossing the sky over the Kaaba. Nothing stopped. No one intervened. No one even looked up. But someone in the crowd saw an opportunity, not for justice, but for entertainment. Some of the Quraysh chiefs, knowing the enmity between Abu al-Hakam and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, said to the boy mockingly, cruelly, "Go to Muhammad. Go and tell him your problem. He will help you get your money from Abu al-Hakam." They were not trying to help the child. They wanted to watch a confrontation. They wanted to see what would happen when Muhammad walked into the house of his most vicious enemy and asked him for money. They wanted drama. They wanted humiliation. They wanted to laugh. The child, innocent, unaware of the politics swirling around him, did exactly what they told him. He went to the Prophet ﷺ, and here is where you begin to see why Allah chose this man to carry his final message. The Prophet ﷺ did not hesitate. He did not weigh the political risk. He did not calculate whether this was a trap. He did not ask who sent the boy or why. He saw a child in need. That was enough. He stood up and walked with the boy, this barefoot, stripped orphan, directly to the house of Abu al-Hakam, the man who plotted against him daily, the man who mocked him in public gatherings, the man who would later be responsible for some of the most brutal persecution of the early Muslims. The Prophet walked into that house with a child at his side and said, simply, "Give this boy what belongs to him." And Abu al-Hakam complied. He did not argue. He did not refuse. He brought out the orphan's money and handed it over. The Quraysh, who had been watching from a distance, waiting for the fireworks, were stunned. They came to Abu al-Hakam afterward, taunting him, "Have you left your religion too? Have you become a follower of Muhammad?" And his answer revealed something extraordinary. He said, "By God, I have not left my religion, but I saw on his right and on his left a spear that I feared would pierce me if I refused." He saw nothing with his eyes. There were no soldiers, no weapons, no army. But something in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, some weight, some authority, some force that came from beyond the human, terrified a man who feared nothing in Makkah. This is the man the Prophet ﷺ would rename. He stripped him of the title Abu al-Hakam, the father of wisdom, and gave him a new one, Abu Jahl, the father of ignorance. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he used his intelligence to crush those who could not fight back, because he had every resource to be just and chose instead to be cruel, because his knowledge brought him no closer to the truth and his power brought him no closer to mercy. And it was in this world of renamed men and naked orphans and chiefs who watched cruelty as entertainment, that 7 verses began to descend. The surah did not arrive with thunder. It did not open with a command or a prohibition. It opened with a question, and the question itself was the earthquake. Ara'aita alladhi yukadzdibu bid-din? Have you seen the one who denies the recompense? The word ara'aita, have you seen, is not a casual question. In Arabic, it is a summons to attention. It grabs the listener by the collar and says, "Look, look carefully. I am about to show you something you have been living next to, but have never truly seen." And the word ad-din here does not simply mean religion. The scholars Al-Tabari, Ibn Kathir, Al-Qurtubi are almost unanimous that in this context it means the day of judgment, the day of recompense, the day when every soul will stand before Allah and answer for what it did and what it ignored. The surah is asking, do you want to know what a person looks like when they truly, in the marrow of their bones, do not believe that day is coming? Then look. Fadalika alladhi yadu'ul yatim. That is the one who drives away the orphan. The fa at the beginning of this verse carries the force of an entire argument. It means, because he denies that day, because he does not believe he will ever be held accountable, because he has erased the hereafter from his internal map, this is what he does. He shoves the orphan. He takes the child who has no father, no shield, no voice, and he pushes him out of sight. This was not a hypothetical. The people of Makkah knew exactly who this verse was about. The narrations point to Abu Jahl, to Alas ibn Wa'il, to Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, to Abu Sufyan, before his Islam men whose names were known, whose cruelty was documented, whose treatment of orphans was public knowledge. But the surah does not name them, and this is part of its genius. By not naming them, it makes the indictment timeless. It is not about one man in one century. It is about anyone, anywhere, in any era, who denies the day of reckoning and reveals that denial through how they treat the most vulnerable person in their reach. Wala yahuddu ala ta'amil miskin. And he does not encourage the feeding of the poor. Notice the precision. The verse does not say he does not feed the poor, though he does not. It says he does not even encourage others to feed the poor. His indifference is so total, so complete, that he has no impulse to act and no impulse to inspire action. He sees hunger and feels nothing, not guilt, not discomfort, not even the faint social pressure to appear generous. His heart has reached a state where the suffering of others produces in him no response at all. And then the surah shifts. Fa wailul lil musallin. So woe to those who pray. This is the moment that split the surah across two worlds. The first 3 verses describe the open disbeliever, the man who denies the hereafter and acts accordingly. But now the surah turns its gaze to a different kind of person, a person who prays, a person who is counted among the believers, a person who shows up at the congregation and goes through the motions. Many scholars, following the insight of Ibn Abbas, believe this second half was revealed in Medina after the Hijrah, when a new kind of threat had emerged. The hypocrites, the munafiqun, people who professed Islam because it had become politically convenient but whose hearts had never been touched by faith. In Makkah, there was no reason to pretend. Praying openly could get you beaten, tortured, killed. No one prayed for show. But in Medina, Islam was the foundation of the new community. There were social advantages to being seen as Muslim, and so a class of people appeared who performed the prayer without ever meaning it. Alladhina hum and salatihim sahun. Those who are heedless of their prayer. The scholars point out a critical linguistic detail here. The Quran says, and salatihim, heedless of their prayer, not fi salatihim, heedless in their prayer. The difference is everything. To be distracted during prayer is human. Thoughts wander, the mind drifts. Every believer experiences this. But to be heedless of your prayer means that the prayer itself means nothing to you. You delay it, you rush it. You forget it entirely unless someone is watching. You treat it as a burden to discharge, not a meeting with your Lord to cherish. Alladina hum yura'un. Those who make show of their deeds. Riya, the hidden shirk, the act of performing worship so that other people will see you and think you are righteous. The Prophet ﷺ said, "The thing I fear most for you is the lesser shirk, Riya." The companions asked, "What is Riya?" He said, "A man stands to pray and beautifies his prayer because he sees people looking at him. وَيَمْنَعُونَ الْمَاءُونَ. And they withhold small kindnesses." The last verse, the final seal. Ma'un, the small, mundane, everyday things that neighbors share with one another. A cooking pot, a bucket, a handful of salt, a match to light a fire, things that cost almost nothing, things that, when given, barely diminish what you have and yet ease the burden of someone nearby. And these people, these performers of prayer, these architects of public piety, they will not even do this. This is where the surah delivers its most devastating conclusion. It draws a straight line from the pagan chief who shoves an orphan to the hypocrite who prays for applause and withholds a cooking pot. The line is belief in the hereafter. If you truly believe you will stand before Allah, you cannot shove an orphan. If you truly believe your prayer is heard, you cannot turn it into a performance. If you truly believe that everything you have belongs to Allah, you cannot refuse to lend a neighbor a bucket. 7 verses, 25 words in Arabic, and they dismantled an entire civilization's moral architecture. When these verses reached the ears of Makkah and later Medina, they did not simply inform, they detonated. For the chiefs of the Quraysh, Surah Al Maun was an exposure they had never anticipated. These were men who prided themselves on their lineage, their generosity in public feasts, their eloquence in tribal assemblies. Abu Sufyan, before his acceptance of Islam, was known for slaughtering 2 camels a day and distributing the meat, a spectacle of generosity that built his reputation across the Hijaz. But when an orphan once came to him asking for food, the narrations tell us he drove the child away with a stick. 2 camels for the crowd, a stick for the orphan. This is exactly the fracture that Surah Al Maun cracked open. It declared that generosity performed for an audience is not generosity at all. It declared that the orphan you shove away in private weighs more on your scale than the feast you throw in public. It declared that Allah is not watching the banquet hall. He is watching the doorway where the child stands, barefoot, waiting to be seen. For the early Muslims, this surah became a compass. It taught them that faith was not simply a matter of theological correctness, believing in Allah, affirming the Prophet, accepting the revelation. Faith was operational. It had hands and feet. It showed up in how you treated the person who had no power to repay you. It showed up in the loan of a cooking pot. It showed up in whether you encouraged the people around you to notice the poor or allowed them to keep walking. And for the hypocrites of Medina, the surah was a mirror placed so close to their faces that they could see the cracks in their own performance. These were people who had mastered the external architecture of Islam. They knew when to stand, when to bow, when to prostrate. They showed up at Friday prayers. They greeted the Prophet with the proper formulas, but their prayer had no soul. It was scaffolding without a building. It was sound without meaning. And the surah told them with divine precision that Allah was not deceived. The ripple effect of this revelation went far beyond its initial audience, because Surah Al Maun did something no social reform, no tribal law, no political decree had ever done in Arabia. It connected the treatment of the weakest member of society directly to the most fundamental question of faith. It said, "You cannot separate how you pray from how you live. You cannot separate your belief in the hereafter from how you treat the orphan at your door. You cannot claim to stand before Allah 5 times a day and then refuse to lend your neighbor a pot." This was revolutionary. In a world where religion and social behavior occupied entirely different categories, the Quran fused them into one. And it did so not through a long philosophical argument, not through a scholarly treatise, not through a complex legal code. It did so in 7 verses, so short that a child could memorize them, and so deep that scholars have been writing about them for 1400 years. The Prophet ﷺ himself embodied the surah before it was revealed. He was the man who walked into the house of his worst enemy to defend an orphan's right. He was the man who said, "I and the one who sponsors an orphan will be in paradise like this." And he held up his index and middle fingers, pressed together with barely any space between them. He was the man who said, "The best house among the Muslims is the house in which an orphan is treated well, and the worst house among the Muslims is the house in which an orphan is treated badly." He did not deliver these words from a position of privilege. He delivered them as someone who had been that orphan. He knew the cold. He knew the vulnerability. He knew what it felt like to be the child with no father in a city that only respected fathers. And when Allah sent down Surah Al Maun, it was as if the entire arc of his life, from orphan to prophet, from powerless child to the most powerful moral voice in Arabia, had been building toward this moment. The orphan was not a footnote in Islam. The orphan was the foundation, the first test, the defining question. Not, do you believe in God? But what does your belief make you do when a child with nothing stands in front of you and asks for help? 14 centuries have passed since these 7 verses descended. The camels of Makkah have been replaced by cars. The trading caravans have been replaced by global supply chains. The tribal assemblies have been replaced by social media feeds. But the question at the heart of Surah Al Maun has not aged a single day. Have you seen the one who denies the recompense? That question is not historical. It is not directed at Abu Jahl. It is not directed at Al-Walid or Al-Az or the Quraysh. It is directed at whoever is listening right now. Because the surah was not revealed to condemn one generation and leave every future generation comfortable. It was revealed to create a permanent diagnostic, a test that every believer must administer to themselves, not once, but constantly. And the test is not theological. It is not, do you believe in the day of judgment? Almost every Muslim would answer yes. The test is behavioral. It is, does your belief in that day change the way you treat the people around you? Does it change what you do when no one is watching? Does it change the small, unglamorous, unrewarded moments of your daily life? The orphan in your world may not be a barefoot child in the desert. The orphan in your world may be the refugee family down the street whose children you have never spoken to. The orphan in your world may be the nephew whose father died and whose inheritance is being managed by relatives who have not given him a cent. The orphan may be the child in your own home who is being fed and clothed, but never listened to, never respected, never made to feel that they matter. And the poor person whose feeding you do not encourage that person may be the homeless man you pass every morning without a glance. That person may be in a country you will never visit, suffering from a hunger you will never feel, and you have never once used your voice, your platform, your influence to say, "This matters. We should do something." The prayer you perform, is it "an salatihim sahun"? Are you heedless of it, not distracted in it, heedless of it? Is the prayer something you rush through on autopilot, something you delay until the last possible moment, something you perform with your body while your mind is already planning dinner, checking your phone, thinking about work? And the Ma'un, the small kindness, are you withholding it? The smile you could give, the door you could hold, the dish you could send to the neighbor who just had a baby, the $5 you could lend without asking for it back, the phone call you could make to someone who is lonely. These are not grand acts of charity. They are the microscopic indicators of whether your faith has actually entered your heart or is still sitting on the surface of your tongue. Surah Al Maun was revealed because a civilization had convinced itself that cruelty toward the powerless was acceptable as long as the powerful kept performing their rituals. It was revealed because a city full of people who walked around the Kaaba 7 times a day could watch a naked orphan be shoved into the dust and not feel a thing. It was revealed because the gap between what people claimed to believe and how they actually lived had become so vast that only Allah could name it. And He named it in 7 verses. Not with thunder, not with the drama of a destroyed nation or a split sea, with a question, the quietest, most lethal question ever asked. Have you seen? Not have you heard, not have you been told. Have you seen with your own eyes, in your own life, in your own mirror? Because the answer to that question is not something you say, it is something you live. It is the orphan you reach for instead of shove. It is the prayer you protect instead of perform. It is the small, weightless, invisible act of kindness that no one will ever see, no one will ever praise, no one will ever record except the one who sees everything. That is why Surah Al Maun was revealed. Not to condemn a dead generation, but to wake a living one. And the question it asks is still hanging in the air 1400 years later, waiting for your answer. Not in words, in what you do next.